The river carried a quiet weight that morning, as if the Thames itself understood that kingdoms could tremble without a single sword being drawn. London woke beneath a veil of pale mist, the stone facades of palaces and churches softened by the early light, and yet the air felt taut, suspended between memory and uncertainty. A city that once watched its king walk to a scaffold now stood at the threshold of another turning. In that gray stillness, before carriages rumbled and bells called the faithful, a question floated like breath in cold air. How firm is a crown when placed atop a quarrel of faith and power? Long before the world would speak of revolutions and constitutions, there lived a prince whose life unfolded in the long shadow of a fallen throne. James, son of a king who had believed too fiercely in the ancient right of monarchs, learned early that loyalty to a crown could break nations. He had tasted exile as a boy, crossing borders not with triumph, but with solemn resolve, carrying in his heart a memory of banners lowered and voices silenced. Where others saw defeat, he found devotion. Where others remembered fear, he held fast to duty, and to a faith he believed could heal the soul of a country still shivering from civil strife. He returned when the wind changed and the monarchy breathed again, a soldier before he was sovereign. On distant fields and aboard proud ships, he built a legacy of discipline and steadfast courage. Yet even as he defended England with steel and strategy, his soul bowed before a different banner, not the lion of his realm, but the cross of a faith distrusted by many around him. His devotion was quiet at first, tucked away like a cherished letter, but in nations, as in hearts, secrets have gravity. In the grand halls where monarchs weighed laws and alliances, whispers began to gather like storm clouds. A prince who walked in step with a church across the sea, a man shaped by the firm hand of conviction in a land that had long feared the return of old devotions. When the moment came, and his brother's crown passed to him, the throne seemed to glow with promise. The nation, weary of instability, craved certainty, and James, newly crowned, believed sincerely that he could offer it. Yet in court chambers and taverns, in quiet parishes and crowded docks, the murmur grew. Could a kingdom built by one faith be steered by another? Was loyalty a matter of crown or creed? Some praised him as a defender of conscience, a ruler willing to stand against prejudice. Others looked upon him with wary eyes, convinced that tolerance could conceal ambition and that mercy might lead to dominance. In those days, every decree, every appointment, every prayer whispered by the king felt like an echo of ancient struggles for the soul of the nation. This was not a tale of battlefields and triumphal arches. It was a story of thresholds, of choices made behind heavy doors, of letters sealed in haste, of families divided at dinner tables, and of soldiers unsure which banner to follow when allegiance itself began to shift like tides. It was a moment when Europe watched with breath held, for the fate of one island kingdom seemed to ripple outward, touching courts from Paris to Vienna, from Rome to Amsterdam. In the quiet before history's great escalation, James walked the corridors of Whitehall, convinced that God and law aligned at his side. His voice carried the certainty of kings who believed authority to be sacred, his steps firm upon marble that had known triumph and tragedy alike. And yet, beyond the palace gates, a different certainty gathered, that the age of unquestioned crowns was fading, replaced not by chaos, but by a new balance of power in which subjects would one day stand shoulder to shoulder with rulers. As candles burned low in council chambers and the ink dried on proclamations meant to carve a future by will alone, the realm prepared, not for war of bodies, but for a reckoning of principles. When change finally arrived, it would not thunder like a charge of cavalry. It would move quietly, like dawn over river water, reshaping the world not with noise, but with resolve. And so this story begins in calm, not conflict, in a kingdom both proud and uneasy, guided by a king both steadfast and misunderstood. His reign would test whether devotion could coexist with liberty, whether tradition could yield to new forms without breaking, and whether a crown worn in sincerity could survive a tide that called for shared authority. Stay with this journey to its final moment, Watch as loyalties fracture and ideals reshape the earth beneath thrones. Witness how a monarch's hope for unity collided with a nation's fear of lost identity, and how this clash forged a new vision of power, not only for England, but for the world that followed. To understand how freedom and monarchy learn to share a single stage, you must walk each step of this path. Stay until the end. The quiet beginning you've just entered carries an echo that still shapes modern rule, and the final turn will reveal how one king's faith and one nation's anxiety created a revolution without a roar, but with consequences that continue to breathe in our age. Yet calm born from victory is rarely true calm. Beneath the settled dust of rebellion, beneath the polished ceremonies of restored order, something quieter began to move. Not defiance, but doubt. Not crowds in arms, but minds turning in private. James looked upon the stillness and saw confirmation of righteous purpose. The nation looked upon it and saw only a pause, a breath drawn before the next uncertainty. For in England, peace is not merely the absence of conflict, but the fragile truce between faith and memory. And so, as bonfires dimmed and the last rebel pikes were stacked in silence, another struggle stirred. One not of steel, but of conscience. The king, believing the moment ripe to bind a wounded kingdom with. Mercy reached toward toleration, and in that gesture meant to soothe, the country sensed the beginning of something greater than reprieve, a test not of loyalty, but of identity. Thus the reign passed from rebellion's roar to the murmuring debate of faith and liberty, where the next challenge rose not from fields or fortresses, but from the very soul of the nation. The silence that introduced his reign did not last long. It never does in a kingdom whose identity had been forged through struggle, not only for land and crown, but for the very definition of faith itself. England in those years breathed through lungs scarred by theological conflict, and every whisper in the wind carried memory of sermons that shook pulpits, of monarchs who prayed in different tongues, of laws written to protect conscience and sometimes to restrain it. Beneath the surface always lay an older fear that the old religion, once cast out, might one day return with quiet steps and reclaim the soul of the nation. Suspicion was not born overnight. It had deep roots, older than James, older than his father, older even than the Civil War that had sent him across seas as a child. The break with Rome under Henry VIII had begun as a matter of sovereignty, but over generations it had grown into a conviction, fierce, defining, and inseparable from the idea of English liberty. And where conviction hardens, fear often follows. To many in Parliament and pulpit, Catholicism was not merely a faith, but a foreign power, a chain that might bind England to continental interests and extinguish the independence its people had come to regard as sacred. Such anxieties shaped laws and lives. Among the measures designed to keep influence at bay, none carried more symbolic weight than the Test Act. It required all office holders to reject key Catholic doctrines and affirm the supremacy of the English Church. It was a declaration sharp and clear, written not only to guide policy but to draw a line through the nation. On one side, allegiance and opportunity; on the other, exclusion. Many conformed with ease, believing sincerely or pragmatically that unity demanded clarity. But for a prince whose mind and heart had already begun to lean toward Rome, the requirement became a test of identity. James had served his country well as Lord High Admiral. The fleet was a symbol of England's reach and security, and under his command it had grown in strength and discipline. He walked the decks not as a distant royal, but as a man who understood wind, tide, and the strain of rope under pressure. Sailors respected his resolve. They had seen him among them, steady in danger, calm in command. To many, he embodied the duty of his house, the Stuart promise of order after chaos. Yet duty in one realm could not erase devotion in another, and when the Test Act forced him to choose, he did not waver. With measured dignity, he resigned his post rather than deny his faith. The gesture, simple in form, thundered through court and countryside. Some admired his conviction. In a nation that cherished conscience, there was honor in refusing to bend. Others perceived danger. A prince who set loyalty to church above loyalty to crown might one day reshape the realm to match his beliefs. That anxiety did not shout. It whispered, gathering weight, as it passed from drawing room to tavern, from sermon to street corner. If his resignation stirred unease, his marriage deepened it. Mary of Modena, youthful and graceful, arrived from across the Channel not only as a bride, but as a symbol. Her beauty was undeniable, her presence regal yet gentle. Yet in the imagination of many English observers, she represented not a companion to the heir, but a bridge to a foreign altar. Her wedding to James illuminated the grand halls with ceremony and hope for dynasty, but for a portion of the kingdom it also cast long shadows. In the rise and fall of courtly music, in the glitter of jewels and candlelight, some heard the faint echo of a different choir, one singing in Latin. Mary herself sought peace, not conflict. History often places figures like her in roles they did not choose, assigning meaning to gestures that were personal before they were political. She entered her new country with grace, eager to be accepted, yet to many, she remained a reminder of a world England believed it had left behind. Innocent actions, a private chapel, a mass heard quietly, became points of scrutiny. A queen consort's devotion, tender and sincere, turned into fuel for rumor. It was an age when printed words could inflame passions as fiercely as any trumpet of war. Pamphleteers filled London's narrow streets with sheets of ink and accusation, as presses worked tirelessly not only to inform, but to shape fear. In alehouses, men leaned close to decipher fresh broadsides. In salons, noblewomen whispered over tea about the latest column. Some publications warned of plots and hidden alliances, others mocked royal sympathies, all feeding a public imagination already restless. Fiction and fact blurred, as uncertainty often grants invention more power than truth itself. When tongues tire, imagination continues. Rumors say little about the people they target, and much about the anxieties of those who spread them. In coffeehouses where political debate flourished, in churchyards after sermons, in marketplaces bustling with merchants and gossip, a phrase began to circulate with uneasy conviction: the fear of a popish tyranny. It was not reality that unsettled hearts. It was the possibility of what might become real if caution faltered. The specter of a papal court in London, the uneasy image of English bishops answering to Rome, haunted minds like a story told at dusk to stir unease before nightfall. Even those who wished for harmony felt tension tighten around them. Friends who once conversed freely now weighed words. Clergy measured sermons, careful not to sound rebellious yet unwilling to surrender conviction. Politicians learned to speak in guarded tones, balancing loyalty with vigilance. The court glittered with ceremony, but beneath the polished surface ran currents of unease. Allies of James admired his integrity. Skeptics nodded solemnly, convinced that events were aligning toward a moment when liberty might be tested again. Through it all, James moved with steady purpose. His devotion was not dramatic. It was solemn and internal, rooted not in ambition, but in genuine belief. He saw in tolerance a chance to heal divisions, to prove that conscience need not breed conflict. In his eyes, to exclude believers from service was unjust. To demand conformity was to weaken a kingdom that claimed wisdom. He sought not to impose, but to permit. Yet intentions, however sincere, live within the interpretations of others, and in those days the public ear bent easily toward caution. There is irony in history's turning points. Often those who fear power see danger where none is intended, and those who hold power fail to see that perception can be as potent as reality. James dreamed of a realm at peace with difference. His subjects, remembering the bitterness of past struggles, feared that one man's dream might reshape their world in ways they could not control. In such distance between aim and understanding, tensions do not simply simmer. They form tides that rise quietly, then suddenly crest. England looked outward too, measuring itself against nations across the Channel. France stood as an example both admired and feared, a kingdom radiant in splendor, resolute in authority, guided by a monarch whose alignment with Rome was firm and proud. To some, it appeared a model of strength, to others, a warning. If England followed such a path, would its ancient rights fade? Would Parliament's voice weaken? Would sermons change, laws alter, freedoms retreat before ceremony and creed? These were not idle questions. They shaped dinner-table conversations, influenced votes, and guided prayers spoken in country chapels. Meanwhile, in private chambers, James prayed not for dominance but for clarity and stability. His letters reveal a man firm in belief, yet yearning for acceptance, confident in faith, yet troubled by mistrust. He saw himself not as challenger to English liberty, but as guardian of conscience. His resolve made him admirable to some, unyielding to others. In his determination, many saw strength. In his steadfastness, others saw inflexibility. A king's virtues interpreted through the lens of fear can become signs of threat. As months passed and seasons turned, unease settled more deeply into the life of the kingdom. Debates sharpened, sermons invoked vigilance. A subtle line divided those who trusted the king's intentions and those who braced for change. In council, voices urged moderation. In pamphlets, warnings grew louder. No decree had overturned law, no army marched, yet the air thickened, as though history itself paused to watch what path England would take. This was the quiet tension before a dramatic age, a nation not yet in crisis, but on the edge of one, trust frayed, not through acts of force, but through shadows of fear. And in those shadows moved figures who believed they were safeguarding a future built on liberty as they understood it. England, shaped by faith and guarded by caution, braced for what might follow when conviction met suspicion. Before long, events would press harder. Decisions made with calm resolve would echo louder than intended. Acts meant to broaden tolerance would be read as signals of ambition. The kingdom would not be pushed toward conflict by decree or sword, but drawn toward a crossroads by belief. Belief in freedom, belief in conscience, belief in the delicate balance between ruler and ruled. Yet for this moment, history held its breath. A king stood firm in faith. A nation watched, unsure, and between crown and people stretched the fragile thread of trust, strained by memory, tested by hope, and destined soon enough to break or transform under the weight of time. Order returned, but only on the surface. The drums had ceased, and the courts had fallen silent, yet the sentences lingered like a chill that fireplaces could not dispel. James read the quiet as vindication. The nation heard it as warning. In taverns and vestries, the talk softened, then thinned, but it did not vanish. It settled deeper into the habit of caution, and from that stillness, the next movement of the reign emerged, not with musters or proclamations, but with a principle the king held as tightly as his scepter, that conscience, once guarded by the crown, might heal old wounds. Thus the realm passed from the thunder of rebellion to the subtler test of toleration, where every act meant as balm could also be read as blade, and where calm itself became the stage on which suspicion learned to speak again. The passing of a monarch rarely arrives as a surprise to history, yet its touch always sends ripples through the spine of a kingdom. When Charles II had breathed his last in February of 1685, London moved with a hush that felt older than its stones. Bells tolled with deep, slow rhythm. Shutters closed not in panic, but in solemn recognition that an era had drawn to its quiet end. Charles had ruled with wit and calculation, steering between factions with the grace of a man who understood human desire as well as any philosopher. He restored the crown, restored courtly grandeur, restored the rhythm of ceremony to a nation weary of iron rule. And now he was gone, leaving behind a throne polished by reconciliation, but not cleansed of anxiety. James stood prepared, though preparedness did not ease the weight on his shoulders. For years he had lived in the shadow of that inevitability, knowing the crown would one day pass into his hands, yet knowing also that the moment it did, the realm would look at him not with simple loyalty, but with scrutiny sharpened by fear. Few heirs have ascended surrounded by more mistrust, even before they spoke their first decree as sovereign. His eyes, often described by contemporaries as steady and unblinking, revealed neither triumph nor tremor on that day. Instead, they carried the solemn calm of a man who believed deeply in duty, in divine order, and in the path laid before him. He ascended without contest. No rival stood in the hall, no parliamentarian raised objection to his right, no general rallied troops to question the bloodline. England accepted him legally, if not wholeheartedly. Yet beneath the formal bows and ceremonial oaths, unease breathed like a subtle wind beneath a closed door. A Catholic king, openly devout, now held the scepter in a Protestant nation. The coronation unfolded with grandeur, but grandeur does not quiet the mind. Westminster Abbey glowed beneath candlelight and gold cloth. Choirs filled the vaulted ceilings with sound that rolled like waves against ancient walls. Courtiers moved in measured grace, robes trailing, jewels glimmering, silver maces lifted high in emblem of state. But even in the beauty, there lay a discordant tension. The traditional coronation oath, crafted to preserve the rights and worship of the Church of England, rested uneasily on the lips of a monarch whose loyalty to it was sincere in governance yet divided in heart. And so the ceremony, though majestic, felt like a mirror divided, half reflecting triumph, half foretelling trial. Outside, crowds gathered in celebration, cheering the spectacle. Yet in taverns and market corners, the murmurs continued. Some toasted James as a man of courage and principle, one who would bring order and moral clarity. Others whispered that the abbey's hymns concealed the first footstep toward Rome. Perhaps no king ever stepped into power with more earnest conviction that he served both God and country. James believed that authority, rightly held, could foster unity rather than oppression. He saw his faith not as threat, but as foundation, an anchor for conscience, not a tool for domination. And so, one of his earliest aims was to grant wider tolerance to all Christians, Catholic and Protestant alike. A bold idea, rooted in idealism as well as personal conviction. But intentions do not always meet the world on the terms they expect. To many in Parliament, tolerance looks suspiciously like a doorway through which old influence might re-enter. To officers and noblemen, it suggested a reshaping of power and favoritism. England's memory of religious strife was not distant. It sat in living minds, in inherited stories of division, in the echo of arguments spoken in church aisles and family parlors. And so even gentle reforms proposed with sincerity stirred unease before they bore fruit. While council debated and pamphleteers sharpened quills, winds of unrest began to move far from the stately calm of Whitehall. In the West, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, handsome, charismatic, illegitimate son of Charles II, saw opportunity in whispered fears. To his followers, he was a Protestant champion, a defender against imagined tyranny, a symbol that resistance could be noble. He landed in England with a small force, banners fluttering, proclamations promising liberty and godly rule. And people came. Farmers, tradesmen, apprentices, men who believed they were defending their country's soul joined him, not with polished discipline, but with fervor. Yet fervor is not strategy. The rising, dramatic in intention, faltered in execution. When the king's forces met the rebels, it was not a clash of equal armies, but a brief and decisive assertion of state over sentiment. Monmouth, once treated as a courtly ornament in Charles's reign, now stood as a figure of lost ambition. Fear drove him, not destiny, when he fled. And when he was taken, history offered little romance. Rebellion born from rumor rarely earns poetic endings. The aftermath of the rebellion, however, etched far deeper into the nation's memory than the events of the battlefield. With threats subdued, judgment arrived. James believed order must follow insurrection, not from cruelty, but from a conviction that leniency in the face of sedition invited greater danger. To him, rebellion was not merely defiance of his rule, it was breach of divine and civil law. And to restore peace, authority had to be unmistakably asserted. Judge George Jeffreys stepped onto the stage, a man whose sharp mind and forceful presence made him both feared and respected. His court traveled through the West Country, and the sessions that followed would enter historical language as the Bloody Assizes, though the name, coined in later outrage, obscures the nuance of motive and context. It was not raw vengeance that guided Jeffreys, but a fierce belief in lawful order and the necessity of deterrence. Yet belief, when fused with power, can cut as decisively as any blade. Prisoners filled makeshift courts, trembling not only before verdicts, but under the weight of spectacle. Some confessed in trembling voices, hoping for mercy. Others defended their choices with unwavering conviction that they had risen for God and liberty. Sentences passed swiftly. Transportation to distant colonies awaited many. Others faced penalties meant to impress upon the kingdom that rebellion was no honorable dream, but a perilous gamble. The judgments shocked some and satisfied others. Those who believed that a monarch must show strength found reassurance. Those who feared tyranny saw proof of their darkest warnings. In those halls where justice and severity intertwined, one could almost imagine two symbols resting side by side, a sword gleaming with authority and a Bible whispering mercy and judgment alike. James believed he held both. To govern was to protect, and to protect sometimes required sternness, yet the kingdom perceived not balance, but shadow. Each sentence, each verdict echoed beyond the courtroom, carried in letters and gossip, turned into story and warning before reason could catch it. Through it all, James moved with unwavering conviction. To him, rebellion had been met with responsibility. Danger had been confronted with resolve. His conscience was calm, but his kingdom's pulse beat faster. Trust in monarchy, already delicate, grew more fragile. Some saw a protector against chaos. Others saw a sovereign too willing to wield the machinery of law against dissent. Perception, so often more powerful than truth, shifted again, inch by inch, against him. Yet in these months of triumph and tension, James did not imagine his throne precarious. He believed loyalty would hold, that fairness would prevail, that faith in rightful authority would ease fears. He saw the path before him not as perilous, but as righteous. And for a time, stability returned. The rebellion fell silent. The court resumed its rhythm. The crown sat steady, shining under candle and daylight. But beneath the polished floors of Whitehall and the calm surfaces of Parliament benches, new doubts curled like threads of smoke. Thin but persistent, England had accepted James as king. It had witnessed his firmness. It had seen rebellion fall and order restored. Yet the memory of those judgments lingered, not only in the towns that had felt the weight of royal justice, but in the conscience of the nation. For power, once asserted so visibly, must soon contend with the fear it awakens. The crown rested on James's brow with the dignity he believed ordained. But outside palace walls, the idea began to form, quietly, cautiously, that authority, however rightful, must answer not only to tradition, but to consent. And though the throne seemed secure, history had already turned its gaze to what would come next. The sword had been shown, the Bible invoked, justice had spoken, punishment delivered. Yet hearts do not bend as swiftly as laws, and a kingdom once shaken by fear rarely forgets the tremor. In those days, James walked his path, believing he built stability. But the ground beneath him, though appearing firm, had begun to shift, not with rebellion now, but with thought, with whisper, with the growing conviction that the crown was powerful, and that power, when pressed hard upon the moment, might one day be pressed back by the age rising silently beyond it. Thus his reign advanced, not toward violent triumph, but toward a test deeper and quieter, whether a king's certainties could withstand a nation's uncertainties, and whether duty, held with sincere heart, could save a throne when trust, once strained, began to thin like morning mist over the river that had witnessed so many dawns. Order returned to the streets, but not to the mind of the kingdom. The trials had ended, the scaffolds were gone, and yet the echo of judgment lingered like a low note under every sermon and supper conversation. James believed the calm he had forged would give reform its chance. Parliament believed the calm proved how fragile trust could be. England, poised between memory and expectation, learned again that power settled by law can be unsettled by fear. And it was precisely then, when politics seemed to pause and principles stared at one another across a quiet hall, that destiny chose a softer entrance. Not a proclamation, not a regiment's march. A door opening to a candlelit chamber, a midwife's whisper, a newborn's breath. The question of authority, sharpened by courts and councils, would now be recast by a cradle. The calm that followed the rebellion did not last. Calm rarely lingers where mistrust sits like winter frost on stone, waiting only for the slightest warmth to reveal cracks below. James, assured in conscience and strengthened by the defeat of Monmouth, turned his attention to the question he believed lay at the heart of justice and harmony, the liberty of religious conscience. To him, the throne was not merely an inheritance, but a duty to protect faith, even when faith was divided. Yet to protect in one direction is often to provoke in another, and what he saw as balance, many would soon see as imbalance. Parliament assembled again, carrying with it the weight of old suspicions and the pride of long-guarded rights. These were not men easily swayed by royal intention, however sincere. They remembered the civil wars not as distant history, but as lived legacy. Fathers had fought, brothers had fallen, estates had been broken and rebuilt, liberty, political and religious, had been carved painfully into the nation's skin. They would not easily surrender it to good intentions or princely conviction. James did not enter with subtlety. He sought openly to extend relief to Catholics and Protestant dissenters alike, pressing Parliament to relax the Test Act. The arguments he made were measured, almost statesmanlike. A government that excludes loyal subjects weakens itself. Unity cannot grow through coercion. Service to the crown should be granted to those capable, regardless of creed. To him, the principle was noble. To Parliament, it sounded perilously like a doorway. And so debate began, polite at first, then sharpening like steel drawn across whetstone. Members rose to speak, invoking ancient statutes, the church settlement, the meaning of allegiance, the memory of times when monarchs pressed too hard and nations bent until they broke. They spoke not of hatred, but of caution, not of persecution, but of precedent. A king asking for leniency was one thing. A king demanding power to rewrite laws was another. When Parliament resisted, James did not retreat. He dissolved the session and chose a different path, one lined with executive prerogative rather than legislative assent. If the law would not bend through debate, it would bend through dispensation by royal authority, which he believed both legal and divinely sanctioned. The king issued declarations suspending penal laws and granting toleration by decree. To his mind, he had done what justice demanded and conscience required. To many subjects, he had stepped beyond the boundaries of ancient custom. At first, the changes were subtle. An officer quietly replaced here, a magistrate retired there. University rules altered to allow Catholic fellows. Chapel doors opened in towns long accustomed to Anglican exclusivity. But subtlety accumulates. As Catholics and other dissenters entered posts long barred to them, murmurs stirred again in coffeehouses and corridors. Not all who benefited sought to overturn the established faith. Many only wished to serve, to be part of the kingdom they belonged to. Yet each appointment whispered of a path, of a slow turning of the wheel, of a rebalancing that might one day become domination. The army became another stage for uncertainty. England had long feared standing forces in peacetime. The memory of Cromwell's new model army still lived like a phantom in political discourse. A standing army, many believed, answered not to liberty, but to will. When James expanded the military and stationed troops near London, suspicion deepened. Was this precaution or preparation? Were these soldiers guardians of peace or guardians of power? To the king, the troops were instruments of stability. He had seen war, known its chaos, and believed preparedness a duty. But to those who watched from outside the palace gates, the picture formed differently. A monarch with loyal commanders, a growing army, favor shown to Catholics, laws bypassed, councils reshaped. It was not fear of James as a man that troubled them. It was fear of what unchecked monarchy might become. Beyond the Channel, France stood as both beacon and warning. Louis XIV ruled with majestic certainty, the Sun King whose authority radiated through Versailles' gilded halls. James admired France's order, refinement, dignity of crown. But England viewed France through two lenses, splendor and shadow. The Catholic faith held honor there, yet English observers saw also the suppression of dissent, the revocation of tolerance once promised, the swelling power of royal edict. And so comparisons formed, not always fair, but powerful in imagination. Would Whitehall become another Versailles? Would England trade ancient liberties for continental discipline? Would a king, believing himself chosen by heaven, forget the earthly covenant with his people? Ideas move faster than armies. While courtiers debated policy, philosophers sharpened arguments. In private studies and public salons, a quieter battle unfolded between visions of authority articulated by pens rather than swords. Some spoke with Hobbesian tone, believing security the highest good, obedience the price of peace. the state a shield against chaos. Others, drawing from emerging voices like Locke, whispered of natural rights, of government by consent, of the right to resist when power overreached. These ideas did not yet ring through streets like rallying cries, but they threaded through thought, sowing seeds that would one day bloom into revolution, quiet at first, then thunderous. James, confident in righteousness, did not sense the slow turn of the tide. He traveled through the kingdom, meeting subjects, seeking loyalty with sincere heart. In cathedrals and civic halls, he spoke of conscience and charity, of peace through equality, of a kingdom where persecution ended. Some listened with admiration, others listened with fear. For even virtue can appear dangerous when it comes cloaked in unfamiliar form. Universities resisted in their own measured way. Oxford saw royal demand collide with academic tradition when the king sought to install a Catholic head at Magdalen College. Scholars protested not with weapons, but with principle. The crown prevailed, but victory did not conquer hearts. Church pulpit thundered too, some voices imploring obedience to lawful rule, others warning against subtle encroachment. Bishops who refused to read the king's declaration of indulgence from their pulpits became symbols of resistance, not rebellious, but resolute. They were summoned, tried, and ultimately acquitted, a moment that echoed with meaning far beyond courtroom walls. Word spread through taverns, across docks, into manor houses. The law had spoken for the guardians of the church. And, for the first time, James felt not simply opposition, but something colder, the shift of public sentiment. He had hoped to soften prejudice. Instead, mistrust hardened. Still, he pressed on. Perhaps he believed history favored perseverance. Perhaps he believed that tolerance needed force to take root. That time would vindicate him. But a king cannot govern on faith alone when the nation no longer shares it. And England, shaped by centuries of balancing crown and parliament, had begun to mutter a question once unthinkable but now inevitable. Who truly ruled this kingdom? The king, by right, or parliament, by trust? The question did not need to be shouted. It lived in the quiet margins of letters, in the careful tones of counselors, in the measured sermons of clergy, and the knowing glances exchanged in drawing rooms. A nation was thinking its way toward a future in which power might wear a different shape. James believed he strengthened the crown. In truth, he tested its limits. The fabric of authority stretched not by violence, but by conviction, by a king reaching toward a vision of unity, and by a people drawing back toward a memory of liberty. The ground beneath him shifted once more, not with rebellion, but with principle. He stood firm, certain in his purpose. Parliament waited, certain in its caution. And between them lay the old question, dressed now in modern language but carrying the same eternal weight. When a ruler seeks to do right by conscience, but the nation fears the cost, who decides the path? Soon the kingdom would demand an answer, and the answer, when it came, would not only shape a reign, it would reshape the meaning of monarchy itself, not only in England but across the world. For in the quiet prelude to transformation, power rarely falls. It adjusts. And sometimes adjustment arrives not as conflict, but as the gentle, inexorable turning of an age, when ideas walk where armies need not, and the voices of the governed begin to speak in tones the ruler cannot ignore. And so the realm moved forward in uneasy quiet, as if history itself held its breath. The king, confident in righteousness, pressed onward. Parliament watched with wary patience. The church measured each royal gesture like a pulse signaling future illness or future cure. England stood neither in rebellion nor in peace, but in that tense middle place where conviction hardens on both sides, and every prayer, every policy, every whisper feels like a prelude. Yet political tempests often find their spark not in decrees or debates, but in life's most intimate moments. Power may rise and fall in council chambers, but destiny sometimes begins in the stillness of a birth chamber. And as the kingdom strained beneath questions of conscience and authority, fate arrived not armored, but swaddled, tiny, wordless, and without awareness of the storm that would soon gather around his cradle. In the fragile architecture of kingdoms, there are moments when history does not thunder but murmurs, softly at first, then with gathering weight, until the whisper becomes destiny. So it was in the year 1688, when hope and dread arrived swaddled in silk, carried not by armies or edicts, but in the quiet cradle of a royal birth. For years, England had watched Queen Mary of Modena with the anxious eyes of a nation uncertain about its future. She had known sorrow in the shape of children lost before their time, prayers unanswered, hopes deferred. Her private grief had once softened some hearts, even among those wary of her presence. But monarchy is a stage where private life becomes public symbol, and in that year, on a June morning heavy with early summer light, the Queen gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward Stuart, heir to the throne. The event should have been purely joyous. Bells rang through church spires. Cannons sounded across the Thames. Court heralds proclaimed the news with ceremony befitting the continuation of a royal line. The king received congratulations with a solemn, almost reverent calm, his face a portrait of gratitude and triumph, mingled with quiet relief. In the Queen's chamber, candlelight flickered across velvet curtains and polished silver basins, casting warm gold across attendants who moved with softened steps and hushed reverence, as though fearing that sound might disturb the fragile miracle lying in a cradle near the bed. Yet as the bells rang, so did something else, fear, like a second peal beneath the first. For England had grown accustomed to the idea that the throne would pass not to a son, none had lived, but to James's Protestant daughters Mary and Anne. The birth of a boy changed everything. It meant continuity not simply of the Stuart line, but of a Catholic succession, a prospect that struck many as a turning point from which the kingdom might never return. Whispers rose within hours. Whispers are born from fear faster than truth can breathe. In drawing rooms draped in lace and brocade, eyes flickered and fans snapped shut as ladies leaned toward one another. In coffee houses dense with the smell of roasted beans and damp coats, men muttered into their cups. In market squares where gossip traveled faster than grain, tongues loosened. And always the same uneasy refrain, voiced first cautiously, then with growing boldness. Was the child truly born of the Queen? Rumor is a creature that feeds on doubt. It does not require evidence, only imagination. And imagination in times of tension becomes an architect of suspicion. The story took shape. A stillborn infant, a secret plot, a warming pan smuggled into the Queen's chamber, a living child hidden inside and placed into the royal bed as courtiers looked away. It was absurd, fantastical, but also frighteningly convenient for those who feared a Catholic dynasty without end. The warming pan story traveled with astonishing speed. It leapt from whispered conversation to printed pamphlet, from tavern joke to solemn sermon hint. There had been no cameras, no official witnesses beyond courtiers, and in absence of proof, rumor painted portraits more vivid than truth. To believe the tale was to believe not merely that a child had been switched, but that the state itself had been tricked, that monarchy had turned from sacred trust to stagecraft. James dismissed the rumors as slander, as insult not only to his honor, but to the dignity of monarchy itself. In his heart, he felt wounded, not by politics, but by the insinuation that his son's life, so fragile and precious, could be reduced to a symbol of conspiracy. His sense of righteousness deepened. His conviction stiffened. He resolved to face lies with firmness, as he had faced rebellion. But firmness cannot smother fear when fear has found fertile ground. The palace, usually a place of confident ceremony, became a house of echoing steps and shadowed corners. Servants carried candles through long corridors. Behind doors, voices dropped to whispers. One could imagine the scene in chiaroscuro. Glowing wax, rustle of silk, a nurse cradling the infant prince in the stillness of night. While outside, London stirred with suspicion. A king's son slept beside a queen exhausted by labor, both unaware that the future of a kingdom now gathered like cloud around their cradle. Yet beyond the palace, truth fought a losing battle against perception. It mattered little that dozens had witnessed the queen's pains and the infant's birth. It mattered little that the king opened the royal chambers to inspection afterward. Suspicion had already woven itself into the story of the child, and once woven, rumor stitches tighter than fact can unravel. For critics of James, the prince's birth was not merely a domestic event. It was a political earthquake. If the child was legitimate, then the monarchy would pass into Catholic hands for another generation, possibly more. Some saw not an infant prince, but the symbol of a future England ruled in the image of France, a land of absolute monarchy, of church aligned with crown, of dissent shrinking beneath ceremony and decree. And so the birth did not calm storms, it summoned them. Princess Mary, across the sea in Holland, felt the shock in letters written in anxious script. Princess Anne, closer to home yet no closer to ease, reacted with a mixture of disbelief and alarm. Even those who loved the king could not entirely silence their own reservations. The birth shifted political gravity, turning quiet opposition into urgent calculation. In private chambers, noblemen leaned over polished tables, tracing uncertain futures in candle wax and ink. Clergymen exchanged wary glances, debating providence and peril. And, among influential factions, a question, once unthinkable, began to take unexpected shape. If the line of succession would not change on its own, must it be changed? James, meanwhile, remained steadfast in his belief that he fought not for power, but for fairness, for the right of every conscience to breathe freely under a crown ordained by divine right. Yet each act of conviction drove wedges deeper. Every gesture meant to reassure only stirred further doubt, because mistrust once rooted grows like ivy, clinging, spreading, resistant to pruning. There were moments when James sensed the shifting current but mistook its direction. He saw unrest as misunderstanding. He saw resistance as prejudice. His letters show a man convinced that patience would prevail, that reason would calm hearts, that loyalty would outlast fear. He did not yet grasp that fear had already changed shape, no longer fear of instability, but fear of a stability that threatened values more than chaos ever could. Night after night, the palace glowed with candle flame, while outside, talk sharpened in taverns. The image was almost theatrical. Inside, a monarch walking marble floors beneath painted ceilings. Outside, the kingdom that ceiling was meant to shelter, debating whether it had grown too heavy to bear. The tiniest details took on symbolic meaning. A baptism attended by Catholic clergy, the reverent gestures of midwives. Even the Queen's serene composure, once admired, now read as something colder by those predisposed to mistrust. Historical irony hung in the air. A child's birth, often the balm of dynastic uncertainty, had become tinder in a nation already nervous from religious quarrels and political strain. Baby's breath, not battle cry, created the crisis. And in this atmosphere, foreign envoys observed quietly, quills scratching into coded reports. Across the channel, Louis XIV smiled, knowingly believing history to be moving in harmony with his preferences. In the Dutch Republic, William of Orange studied events with the careful eyes of a man who saw both opportunity and duty forming like tide beneath moonlight. The kingdom did not tremble yet, but it waited. And waiting can be more dangerous than action, for it allows thought to ripen into resolve. Behind palace curtains, a cradle rocked slowly, the infant prince unaware that his existence alone bent the arc of history. Nurses sang lullabies in Italian and French-accented English. Guards paced. A queen rested, pale and resolute. A king prayed in quiet chambers, believing providence smiled upon him. Yet beyond those walls, destiny took shape not in nursery song or royal devotion, but in the rising conviction that the future of England could not be left solely to birth, faith, and crown. For a realm living in the memory of civil war and the logic of new political philosophy, inheritance was no longer authority enough. What had begun as the miracle of life was now the spark of reckoning. Soon voices would grow bolder, letters would fly across seas, decisions would sharpen, and the question whispered in the shadows would soon step into daylight. If a child's cradle could alter a kingdom's fate, could a kingdom not claim the right to alter the cradle's claim? The storm had not yet broken, but the sky, lit by palace candles and clouded by public doubt, waited for the first wind to rise. And rise it soon would, not through violence, but through footsteps on foreign shores and invitations sealed in wax, carrying with them the idea that loyalty to crown had limits, and those limits had just been reached. But fear seldom ends where it begins. What started as a cradleside murmur did not vanish with reassurances and witnesses. It hardened into vigilance, parlors emptied of gossip and filled with arithmetic, names, loyalties, contingencies. The lullaby of the nursery gave way to the rustle of parchment and the weight of seals. If the future could be altered by a birth, then, so the reasoning spread like ink through linen, perhaps it could be steadied by a choice. Thus the nation's anxiety, no longer content to circle rumor, gathered itself into purpose, and the whispers that once questioned a prince turned to letters that quietly summoned a protector. In the weeks that followed the birth of the prince, suspicion did not fade. It gathered discipline. What began as scattered whispers began to coalesce into something far more determined. A plan shaped not by anger in the streets, but by calculation in candle-lit chambers. For the first time since the Restoration, the question of who should sit upon England's throne was not simply a matter of inheritance or divine decree, but of choice, conscious, deliberate, perilous. The kingdom's elite did not move quickly. They moved quietly. They understood that resistance in this moment could not look like rebellion. Rebellion had already been crushed, judged, and punished. The lesson of Monmouth lay fresh upon the land. So those who feared for England's future, nobles, ministers, bishops, chose a different path, one paved not with raised banners, but with sealed letters and whispered vows. At the center of their thoughts stood a name already familiar to Europe, William of Orange, stadtholder of the Dutch Republic, Protestant champion, opponent of French absolutism, and husband to Princess Mary, elder daughter of James II. To some, he represented stability, to others, salvation. To all who contemplated him, he represented a bridge between legitimacy and resistance. The first approach did not come in the form of a grand embassy, but as fragments of parchment carried by discreet messengers. 7 signatures, peers, and bishops of influence would later be remembered as the authors of a letter that changed the course of history. Their message was not desperate, but careful, not commanding, but pleading, not dramatic, but resolute. They told William that England looked to him, that its liberties trembled, that its religion stood in peril, and that he must come, not as conqueror, but as guardian of English freedom. Yet beneath their eloquence lay the raw truth. They were inviting a foreign prince to intervene in the affairs of their kingdom. The act was unprecedented, audacious, and dangerous. But danger, in their minds, already sat upon the throne. Across the North Sea, in the brick palaces of The Hague, William listened. He had always been a figure forged of duty more than sentiment. His features were austere, his manner precise, his mind a machine of calculation and conviction. He loved Mary, though not in the way poets describe, but as a partner in destiny. He loved the Dutch Republic as one loves a fragile miracle, always aware that forces stronger than itself could crush it. And he distrusted Louis XIV not merely as a rival ruler, but as a symbol of a world where kings held unchecked power and toleration was extended only by whim. To William, a Catholic dynasty in England did not merely threaten English Protestants, it threatened the balance of Europe. A France-aligned Catholic England could tip the scales forever, isolating the Dutch, emboldening absolutists, endangering the Protestant cause across the continent. The invitation from English lords did not create his resolve. It merely gave it form. Mary, for her part, faced her own crucible. She was daughter to a king, yet wife to a man called to oppose him. When she was told of the invitation, not yet public, spoken only in private chambers, her heart trembled between duty and destiny. She wept not only for her father, but for the fate that placed her between love and loyalty. Yet she understood the stakes. In her letters, she wrote of providence, of responsibility, of the sorrow that accompanies necessity. She would stand not as rebellious daughter, but as reluctant heir to a greater cause. Thus began a diplomatic dance of extraordinary delicacy. English envoys slipped into Dutch territory under assumed purposes. Dutch agents traveled to London disguised as merchants or travelers. Information crossed the sea in ciphered lines. Suspicions moved like chess pieces. James himself sensed the shifting wind, though he underestimated its direction. His ambassadors in The Hague delivered warnings, appealed to kinship, reminded William of his obligations as a son-in-law. The Dutch court responded politely, bowing with courtesy while hiding its deeper intentions behind diplomacy's calm veil. Europe watched in stillness. France, suspicious, sent word to James offering support if needed. Though Louis XIV never rushed where patience could serve him better, German princes whispered in corridors. Venice, ever observant, noted the tide. Rome watched, hopeful and anxious. And in cities across the continent, pamphleteers speculated, though none with certainty, on whether England would soon change not just kings, but the foundation of kingship itself. Plans took shape in Dutch shipyards where wood met iron, where carpenters and sailors worked under strict silence, where materials gathered, but explanations did not. Cannons were polished, muskets stored, bread baked, barrels filled. Orders came in fragments disguised as preparations for naval exercises or defensive readiness. Yet any man who walked the docks and saw the scale of labor might have felt something stirring beyond routine, an armada in waiting. William consulted generals, theologians, merchants, and spies. He drafted proclamations in advance, careful to state his cause as one of liberty, not conquest. Every word weighed, every step measured, for he knew even righteous intervention must wear the cloak of legitimacy. He would come, he decided, not as invader but as protector, to secure England's laws, safeguard its religion, and ensure Parliament had its rightful voice. Meanwhile, in England, the atmosphere thickened. Rumors rippled like wind across fields. Some spoke openly now, emboldened by news, half seen, half imagined that the Dutch were moving. Others prayed quietly in pews, uncertain whether to fear foreign sails or welcome them. The court hardened, trusting less, watching more. And James, still believing his authority ordained and unshakable, did not imagine that the tide now gathered beyond his visible horizon. Summer deepened into autumn. Harvest carts rolled through muddy roads. Church bells marked the turning of seasons. Yet beneath ordinary rhythms, a tremor lived inside daily life. In navy yards along the Thames, officers polished swords with a kind of restless impatience, uncertain whom they would soon serve. In universities, scholars debated loyalty and conscience. In quiet rectories, clergy pondered whether obedience to king or defense of faith mattered most. Hearts wrestled with duty in ways too complex for simple slogans. Then, one mist-laden dawn, white sails, appeared on the Dutch horizon. First one, then many, rising like pale wings against gray sky. The sea, calm yet heavy, bore witness as a fleet unlike any England had seen assembled outside. War approached silently, purposefully, majestically. Decks filled with soldiers who had trained in disciplined silence. Officers clasped maps and orders sealed in wax. Chaplains murmured prayers, not for conquest, but for providence. And at the heart of the fleet, beneath wind-stretched banners and the orange-white-blue of the Republic, stood William, stoic, contemplative, resolute. He gazed not at England as a land to be claimed, but as a responsibility thrust into his hands by forces of history and conscience alike. He knew the storms that might follow. He accepted them. His face did not show triumph. It showed determination, touched with solemnity. Back in England, watchers on the southern cliffs saw distant shapes forming on the water. First, they blinked. Then they stared. And as recognition dawned, so too did realization. Change was no longer a possibility. It was approaching under full sail. Church bells rang again, not in celebration, but in warning. Couriers galloped toward London, hooves striking earth like drumbeats. Smoke rose from signal beacons. Letters flew. And in the royal palace, James felt the air shift, as if history itself had entered the room. He did not yet flee. He did not yet yield. Conviction still cloaked him like armor, but the horizon no longer belonged to him alone. A new force had entered the story, bearing not the cry of rebellion, but the quiet authority of chosen duty. In that moment between calm and upheaval, as sails filled and hearts braced, the world stood at the edge of a transformation not born of sword first, but of ideas, alliances, and letters signed by 7 hands in secret. The fleets drew nearer, the wind favored them, and a nation waited, some with hope, some with dread, knowing that when those ships touched English soil, the meaning of loyalty, liberty, and monarchy itself would be forever rewritten. For the sea had carried not merely ships, but a question turned into resolve. If a king fails to guard the liberties of his people, may the people invite another to guard them? The answer, borne on the tide, was coming. Yet even as the last echoes of those quiet footfalls faded along the Thames, history did not pause to admire its own restraint. A king had departed in silence, but silence is never still in the life of a nation. It settles first, like mist, then begins to move, curling through council chambers, whispering across seas, gathering shape and consequence far from the moment that birthed it. For exile is not an ending. It is a mirror held up to power. And England, newly awakened to its own authority, had begun to see itself differently. And so, while James slipped across the channel into the twilight of memory, the story that awaited him in France did not soften. It deepened, taking on the texture of reflection, regret, and the slow dawning of a new world in which kings no longer commanded by right alone, but by the fragile, formidable grace of consent. The fleet's arrival did not break the silence of dawn. It simply replaced it with a new kind of stillness, the kind that precedes a shift too profound for noise. As the Dutch ships anchored off the coast of England, no cannons roared, no fortresses crumbled. Instead, the wind carried only the low hum of rigging, the murmur of soldiers preparing to disembark, and the steady rhythm of waves against wood, as if the sea itself bore witness to a moment suspended between eras. William stepped upon English soil not with ceremony, but with resolve. He came dressed not as a conqueror, but as a guardian of a cause already stirring within the hearts of those who watched the horizon. His soldiers moved with disciplined calm, planting no flags of triumph, only posts of order. Local villagers emerged cautiously from doorways, eyes wide not with terror, but with wonder. This was no foreign raid, no violent incursion. It felt instead like the arrival of a tide that had been gathering in secret, now breaking gently, inevitably upon the shore. In towns and countryside, the news spread faster than hoofbeats. William had landed. He marched not toward plunder or battle, but toward London, with proclamations promising to defend English laws, religion, and liberties. He invoked Parliament, tradition, and the ancient rights of free-born English subjects. His tone did not thunder, it reasoned, and reason in those days carried a sharper weight than steel. James received the news in Whitehall, standing before courtiers whose faces betrayed more than their words did. He had faced rebellion before. He had quelled uprisings with certainty and imposed order with firm hand. But this was no uprising. This was an invitation answered, a turning of allegiance, quiet but devastating, a movement not of mobs but of men in wigs and robes, mitres and armor, those who spoke softly in council chambers and acted decisively behind closed doors. He ordered troops to assemble. Generals saluted, but their eyes flickered with uncertainty. Officers pledged loyalty, yet letters passed secretly beneath table and cloak. Soldiers obeyed commands, though whispers passed through barracks. What are we fighting for? Who do we defend? The crown or the kingdom? Then, like threads loosening from a tapestry, loyalties began to fall away. Nobles rode from camps under pretense of illness or piety, re-emerging days later at William's side. Members of Parliament, once hesitant, now stepped forward in quiet procession to offer support to the Dutch prince. Even bishops, defenders of hierarchy and order, found themselves drawn toward a new vision of governance, one where the monarch's hand was guided, not unchecked. Most painful of all was the departure of James's own daughter, Princess Anne, who slipped away under cover of night with trusted allies. Her message, when it reached the king, was like a sentence carved into ice. She acted not out of hatred, but necessity. Loyalty to father yielded to loyalty to God and country, at least in the new language forming across England. James felt the walls around him shift. The palace, once a fortress of ceremony and authority, seemed suddenly porous, filled with courtiers who bowed but no longer believed, guards who saluted but no longer stood firm in spirit. Fear crept into his heart, not of death or defeat, but of abandonment. A king without supporters is not merely weakened, he is unmade. He mounted a horse to rally his forces, but found only hesitation where resolve once stood. His speeches met silence. His commands met delays. Generals rode away. Regiments pledged neutrality. The monarchy's scaffolding, carefully built, ceremonially maintained, cracked without a single cannon fired. A storm gathered not in the sky, but in his mind. He felt betrayal coil around him like a rope pulled slowly, tightening not by enemies, but by those who once knelt in loyalty. Panic surfaced, rare in a man so stern yet unmistakable. He considered negotiations, then retracted. He spoke of divine right, then doubted. Every instinct met its mirror, each certainty now a question. Finally, in a moment of tremor disguised as strategy, James attempted to flee. He disguised himself, slipped into the night, and moved toward the Thames where a boat waited, but escape eluded him. He was recognized, seized, and returned to London, not as triumphant sovereign, nor as prisoner, but as something stranger, a king whom the kingdom would not yet dethrone, but no longer wished to obey. Those who detained him did not bind him. They did not parade him. They treated him with courtesy bordering on ceremony. Yet beneath the politeness lay a truth sharp as frost. He was no longer feared, only pitied. His authority had not been taken. It had dissolved. And then, in an act as calculated as it was curious, he was allowed to slip away again. This time, no one intervened. Guards looked elsewhere. Loyalists made no protest. The path to exile opened not through force, but through quiet assent. He boarded a small vessel and vanished across the channel toward France, where Louis XIV awaited, a king leaving the kingdom not in flames, but in silence. England woke the next morning, not to the smoke of battle, but to the soft murmur of change settling into place. No city lay in ruins. No soldiers filled graves. The streets bore no scars of siege. Yet everything had shifted. The crown had passed not through war, but through withdrawal, a surrender not of blades, but of allegiance. William approached London not as conqueror, but as steward. Churches rang with hymns of thanksgiving. Crowds gathered not to hail a hero, but to welcome a protector of rights long threatened. Parliament convened not to rubber stamp royal decree, but to redefine kingship itself. And at court, Mary soon joined. Her husband not with triumphal pride, but with solemn understanding of the cost. She had not merely inherited a crown, she had inherited a broken bond with her father. The revolution had been bloodless in action, yet immense in consequence. It had not toppled a king by force, but by withdrawing obedience, proving that authority rests not in crowns alone, but in consent. England had chosen, not through riot, but through refusal. And in choosing, it had whispered a new truth into the world. A king may rule by birth, but he reigns only by trust. Political theorists would later call it balance, constitution, contract. Philosophers would trace its lines in treatises and lectures. Nations would watch, learn, imitate, or resist. Thrones elsewhere would tremble, not immediately, but in time. For a door had been opened, quietly yet decisively, and through it stepped not swords, but ideas. And so, history would remember this passage not as a battle, but as the glorious revolution, glorious not in spectacle, but in what it quietly dismantled and boldly created. No clash of armies, no rivers changed course, yet the world shifted. The divine right of kings did not disappear, but it no longer stood unchallenged. The people had spoken without shouting. They had changed their monarch without raising a blade. Later generations would call it miraculous, peaceful, enlightened. But beneath those words lies a deeper, sharper line, a revolution without blood, yet saturated in the meaning of power. And in that quiet transfer, England stepped into a new age, not of chaos but of constitutional order, where kingship was not abolished but reimagined, where liberty did not roar but unfolded, where the future arrived not with thunder, but with the soft sound of footsteps crossing a channel and a monarch boarding a ship in the night. From that silence came a new voice in history, the voice of a nation learning that rulers may be chosen, unmade, and chosen again not by war, but by will. And though no soldier fired a shot, the world was never the same again. As London woke to a revolution written in restraint rather than fire, the kingdom settled into a new grammar of power, crowds murmuring, bells answering, Parliament finding its voice where swords had stayed sheathed. Authority did not crash. It receded, like a tide leaving behind the firm sand of law, and when the water drew back far enough, it revealed the next inevitable scene. A solitary figure moving toward the river under a winter sky, a boat rocking at the Thames, a coastline fading into mist. What England affirmed in quiet, consent over command, France would receive in silence. Thus, the story that began with white sails on a gray horizon continued with a single wake across the Channel, a monarch departing without a battle to lose, and an age arriving without a battle to win. He crossed the Channel not as a king visiting a foreign court, but as a man arriving at the end of the world he thought he ruled. France received James not with thunderous parade, but with velvet courtesy, the kind offered to fallen greatness, touched by sympathy, yet framed by distance. At Versailles, Louis XIV extended hospitality, polished and ceremonial. Yet even in gilded halls, exile was unmistakable. James walked through marble galleries, not as monarch of a proud island, but as a guest preserved by protocol, sheltered yet stripped of power. He settled at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a palace lent to him by the French king. The rooms were elegant, the gardens formal, the chapels resonant with quiet devotion. But comfort cannot soften the ache of a throne lost. Courtiers loyal to him moved through corridors with dignity tinged by nostalgia, their voices soft but their hearts heavy. They served a king without a kingdom, preserving ceremony so that memory could substitute for authority. Candles burned beside portraits of past rulers, and sometimes James lingered before them, perhaps wondering whether he belonged to their lineage or stood apart as a cautionary legend. News traveled across the Channel. William and Mary had been crowned. Parliament confirmed them not merely by blood, but by choice, a phrase James found difficult even to contemplate. Crowds in London celebrated with bonfires, bells, and toasts. The coronation was not just the rise of a new monarch, but the birth of a new principle, that kingship flowed not solely from lineage and divine will, but from the consent of the governed. A sovereign no longer stood above the nation, immutable and unquestioned. A sovereign now stood with the nation, or not at all. Soon came the document that crystallized the moment, the Bill of Rights of 1689. It did not roar like a declaration. It spoke in measured, legal voice. Yet its words remade the world. It placed limits on royal power, strengthened Parliament, safeguarded certain liberties, and etched into law the principle that no monarch might govern without the nation's legal and political assent. It was calm, precise, unromantic, and deeper than any sword stroke. A monarchy once absolute had become constitutional. From France, James learned of this not as a participant in history, but as its subject. He read with a mixture of disbelief, sorrow, and stubborn resolve. He saw not reform, but rupture. To him, this was not progress. It was betrayal of the natural order. Monarchs received their crowns from God, not assemblies. Authority flowed downward, not upward. He believed this as truly as he believed the sacraments he attended each morning. In his eyes, he had not lost a throne. He had been robbed of it by an idea, dangerous and new, and so he did not accept defeat. Exile sharpened his purpose. If England had set him aside, he would return by right and by faith. Allies gathered in dark walnut rooms. Maps were unrolled, and whispers took form. Across the Irish Sea, loyalty still glimmered. Ireland, largely Catholic, saw in James not a failed king, but a symbol of hope, a man who might restore their rights and faith. He sailed there, greeted by cheers and trust, welcomed as the rightful ruler, returning to reclaim his destiny. Ireland prepared for his banner. Hopes swept through green hills and stone towns, but hope alone does not conquer. William moved swiftly. His armies were trained, his officers seasoned, his cause aligned with Europe's broader struggle against absolutism. On the banks of the Boyne River in 1690, the two worlds met, one looking back, one looking forward. The confrontation did not become a tale of glory. It became a moment of realization. James withdrew, crossing waters once more, not in triumph, but in resignation, softened by faith, yet sharpened by disappointment. He returned again to France, this time without illusions of swift restoration. Saint-Germain received him once more, less as king in waiting, and more as king in memory. His household remained loyal, their devotion unwavering. Yet devotion cannot fill silence. Over the years, the palace grew quieter. Those who had once dreamed of return spoke less often of strategy and more often of nostalgia. Children of exiles grew up speaking French as easily as English. Seasons passed across the gardens, each one slightly dimmer than the last. James aged with dignity, but not peace. He prayed often, read devoutly, walked slowly beneath lime trees, occasionally glancing eastward as though distance might dissolve. His letters revealed steadfast belief, but also loneliness. He spoke of God's will, of trials endured, of faith rewarded in eternity, if not in this life. He visited chapels lit by silver lamps, kneeling in stillness while memories hovered like faint shadows at his side. Sometimes visitors from England arrived, diplomats, sympathetic nobles, or curious travelers. They brought news of a country now living under the new settlement, Parliament asserting its role, monarchs governing in partnership rather than command, laws growing sturdier than crowns. They described a nation moving into a new age, not with haste, but with certainty. James listened politely, but each word must have echoed like a distant bell tolling a world that no longer belonged to him. He became a figure of paradox, revered by those who saw him as martyr of principle, dismissed by those who viewed him as relic of absolutism. In quiet moments, he may have wondered whether steadfastness was duty or stubbornness, whether faithfulness to divine right was noble or tragic. But such doubts, if they existed, lived only in the private corners of his soul. Court life continued around him with gentleness. Birthdays marked without celebration, anniversaries honored in quiet prayer. Children of courtiers grew into adults who knew James not as king, but as solemn elder, surrounded by a past they had only heard described. He walked gardens where fountains murmured and roses climbed walls, the music of Versailles occasionally reaching his ears from distant salons. That music was not his. It belonged to a world where kings still reigned without question, a world he had been born into and watched fall away. He passed his final years not in rage, but in contemplation. When he spoke of England, it was with longing, not bitterness. He did not curse the age that rejected him. He prayed for it. And in the end, surrounded by loyal faces now softened with years, he left the world quietly, much as he had once left his kingdom, without violence, without storm, with faith intact but power gone. In England, history continued. William and Mary's reign unfolded, Parliament grew stronger, and the settlement of 1689 became not merely an event, but a foundation. A future rooted in law and consent stood in place of the ancient certainty of divine right. England did not abandon kingship, it reshaped it. The crown still gleamed, but it gleamed atop a new structure, one where liberty and monarchy walked together rather than in struggle. James II became a story told beside fireplaces, in lectures, in prayers, and in cautionary debate. He was remembered not as tyrant, nor as hero, but as the last English king who believed wholly that power flowed from God alone, a conviction noble in faith, yet outpaced by history. Through him, the world witnessed a truth that would ripple far beyond the island that shaped him. A throne may be given by providence, but it is preserved by the people. The age of unquestioned monarchs dimmed. The age of constitutional liberty dawned. And somewhere in the memory of Saint-Germain, in the quiet rustle of leaves where an exiled king once walked, one can almost hear a whisper carried on the breeze, neither triumphant nor defeated, but solemn. A king stood firm in belief, and a nation moved into a new world without him. And yet, history never concludes at the moment of departure. A king crossing a sea is not simply an ending, it is the hinge upon which an era turns. When James's ship disappeared beyond the gray horizon, England did not simply lose a monarch, it gained a question. What should power look like in a world learning to think, argue, print, and believe in its own voice? As carriages rolled through London and parchment rustled in Parliament chambers, the answer did not arrive with shouts, but with the steady, thoughtful sound of a nation redefining itself. James's footsteps faded in the gardens of Saint-Germain, but across the Channel, footsteps echoed in Westminster, steady, confident, forward. The silence of his exile was met by the rising murmur of a kingdom that had chosen not rebellion, but evolution. This was not the fall of a crown. It was the reshaping of the very idea of kingship. From here, the story did not descend into chaos. It unfolded into order, not the rigid order of divine command, but the crafted balance of law, consent, and shared authority. Thus began the true legacy of the crisis, not the end of monarchy, but the birth of constitutional monarchy, not the silencing of a king, but the awakening of a nation. He left behind a palace, but what lingered was not a fallen crown. It was the shape of a question that could no longer be ignored. In the quiet that followed his departure, England stood suspended between two eras, as though the very air paused to feel the shift. The Thames flowed beneath gray skies. Parliament's windows reflected a new kind of mourning, and the bells of London sounded not for victory nor mourning, but transition. No single proclamation marked the change. No statue fell. Yet the transformation pressed itself into the life of the kingdom with a certainty deeper than decree or battle. Some felt sorrow for the old king, others felt relief. But nearly all sensed they were walking across a threshold, and that England would not return to what it had been. James carried with him a conviction as ancient as monarchy itself, that kings ruled because heaven chose them. In another age, that belief had lifted empires, but the 17th century was not an age of simple obedience. It was a century of pamphlets and sermons, coffee houses and debates, merchant ships bringing ideas as well as goods. It was an age when individuals argued theology in public and questioned politics by candlelight. The king had fought not against rebels, nor armies, nor churches, but against time. And time does not yield, even to the most determined sovereign. Across the Channel, James prayed and waited, but his throne did not call him home. Across England, something new began to take form, not in parades, but in the pages of statutes, not in swords drawn, but in pens moving across parchment. Parliament assembled beneath high ceilings and tapestries, its members speaking in tones more confident than ever before. They had not simply replaced one ruler with another, they had redrawn the boundary between ruler and ruled. The ink that sealed the Bill of Rights dried like a quiet verdict on centuries of divine absolutism. Power had changed seats, not vanished, merely relocated, from the unassailable grasp of one man to the steady hold of a nation's laws and representatives. A throne transformed, the monarchy did not disappear. The crown still gleamed, ceremonies still dazzled, and royal coaches still rolled along London streets. But the throne, once a solitary peak, now rested on foundations shared with Parliament. It became not a symbol of supreme command, but a seat within a constitutional order where sovereignty was divided, structured, and answerable. In private chambers, scholars scribbled notes. In quiet churches, preachers reminded their congregations that kings are mortal, but justice endures. In merchants' halls, men toasted to a future where trade, not royal whim, would define prosperity. Where once obedience had been instinct, now consent became the measure of authority. For centuries, rulers across Europe had spoken the language of divine mandate. Now across the continent, whispers began, measured, cautious, but persistent. If England could temper its crown with law, why not others? The answer would unfold slowly, but the ripple had begun. The Stuart legacy. The Stuarts had risen with fire and passion, bearing visions of sacred kingship and heavenly right. They had spoken of unity under crown and altar, of God's will shaping the world through royal hands. But they had lived in a world newly filled with printed heresy, political philosophy, mercantile ambition, and national identity. They tried to command a century that was learning to ask questions, and the last Stuart king to sit upon England's throne learned too late that principles are not power unless shared by the age that holds them. His tragedy was not arrogance, it was anachronism. The new order. With William and Mary came more than a reign, came a settlement. It was not perfect, nor universally fair. Catholics still faced prejudice. Religious freedom grew slowly, unevenly, steered by caution more than generosity. Parliament did not represent all voices, only those allowed a seat at the table. But for the first time, the path had opened. Not a revolution of barricades and flames, but a revolution of balance. The red robes of lords still swept across the chamber. Bishops still raised their voices in debate. But the laws that emerged no longer bore the singular imprint of a king's will. They bore the tempering force of argument, vote, revision, and consent. Commerce expanded. Liberties widened by degrees. The public sphere broadened. The press took deeper root. Thought traveled. And in time, other nations would watch and follow, some willingly, others by force of circumstance. The world had seen kings fall before. What it had rarely seen was a king replaced by an idea that kings could rule only with the people, not above them. The last lesson. At Saint-Germain, James walked gardens where statues stared across manicured lawns, still believing, still praying. He did not spit bitterness at the world. He simply belonged to a world that had already moved beyond him. His defeat was not humiliation, but misalignment. He was a king of faith in an age becoming a kingdom of law. When he breathed his last, it was not with the roar of a dethroned tyrant, but with the quiet sigh of a believer steadfast to the end. And while his supporters wept, history did not weep with them. It bowed its head respectfully and continued on its course. The empty throne. Imagine for a moment the throne room after all was settled. A gilded chair stands in stillness. No figure occupies it. Light falls across velvet and oak. The hall echoes not with command, but with memory. In that hush, one can almost hear, not footsteps, but principles taking their place beside tradition. Law, consent, balance, liberty, imperfect, but awakening. The monarchy endures, polished, dignified, ceremonial, but beside it stands a parliament grown tall, and beyond that, parliament, a people learning that their voice matters. And so the story ends, not with sword raised or palace aflame, but with a sovereign walking away and a nation stepping forward, not in tragedy and not in triumph, but in evolution. James II did not lose his crown because of faith. He lost it because he could not understand his century, and from that loss rose something far greater than a dynasty, a monarchy restrained, a constitution rising, a people claiming their voice. The bells that once hailed kings now rang for rights. The throne remained, but it would never again stand alone. In the silence of history's turning page, the sound that lingers is not mourning, nor celebration, but the clear, steady chime of freedom beginning to speak. The throne stood polished and eternal, yet fundamentally changed. And from that silent chamber of transformation, our story now draws to its final reflection, not of a king alone, but of a century, a kingdom, and the moral forces that reshape power without a single trumpet sounded. History rarely ends with simplicity. It settles instead like evening mist, softening the edges of conflict and allowing the deeper currents to show. James II had believed in a world arranged from heaven downward, a world where obedience was not oppression but order, and where loyalty to God and crown formed the bedrock of civilization. In that view, he was not wrong. Many monarchs before him had ruled through the same conviction, but conviction is not enough when the world around it has shifted. What once seemed divine certainty became, by the late 17th century, a relic of an older age, venerable but outpaced. England had not rejected monarchy, it had redefined it. And that distinction matters, for the lesson of these events is not rebellion, but adaptation. Rather than destroy the crown, the English political nation chose to reshape it, preserving continuity while embracing accountability. Where tyrants fall to chaos, James fell to constitutional thought, and in that fall lay a dignity, though obscured by disappointment. He became the last English king to imagine his authority untouched by human consent. That idea did not die with bitterness. It receded like an outgoing tide, leaving fertile ground for something new. The glorious revolution was peaceful, not because passions were absent, but because principle triumphed without blades being drawn. It was a negotiation between eras, not an annihilation of one by the other. In his exile, James carried a profound sorrow, the sorrow of someone who acted out of duty as he understood it, yet found the age unwilling to follow. But tragedy does not diminish legacy, it clarifies it. Whether he was a martyr of faith or a prisoner of outdated ideas depends on who holds the mirror. History's perspective evolves, and perhaps the true measure of James lies not in failure, but in what his failure birthed. For in his absence, England discovered a new equilibrium, one that balanced royal dignity with parliamentary authority, personal conscience with public liberty. The Bill of Rights did not abolish monarchy, it anchored it in law. It recognized sovereignty not as a gift from a single source, but as a compact between crown and people. It breathed life into a principle long forming across Europe, that stability rests not in command, but in consent. The voice of the governed, once a whisper, began to speak with confidence. This was not the freedom of modern democracies, nor a perfect triumph of equality. It was, instead, a doorway, an opening through which liberty gradually entered public life. The seeds planted in 1688 grew into ideas that crossed oceans, inspired revolutions, shaped constitutions, and gave ordinary citizens a place in the architecture of power. Parliamentary supremacy, freedom of debate, limitations on executive power. These did not arrive overnight, but they began here. And if the price of this change was the sorrow of one steadfast king, perhaps history carries that sorrow with respect, not ridicule. For James did not yield because he was cruel. He yielded because the world around him refused to remain still. And a world that refuses stillness has already chosen progress. William and Mary did not reign as conquerors. They served as custodians of a new settlement, stewards of a kingdom learning to govern itself as much as be governed. In their shared rule lay a symbolic truth. Sovereignty was no longer singular. Power, like history, had begun to balance rather than dominate. And so we reach the final insight, where past meets principle. Monarchy endured, not by resisting change, but by accepting its place within it. Faith continued not by enforcing unity, but by recognizing diversity. Authority lived on not as unquestioned command, but as trusted stewardship. James's legacy is paradox. The king who lost a crown but helped form a constitution. The sovereign who stepped aside unwillingly, yet by doing so allowed his nation to step forward willingly. In the end, he occupies a solemn and honorable place, the hinge between divine right and constitutional order, the guardian of an ideal fading, and the unwitting midwife to a system rising. History's quiet verdict is not harsh. It is contemplative. His reign did not shatter. It shifted. His departure did not end monarchy. It matured it. His conviction did not prevent progress. It tested it. And by testing it, he strengthened it. So let the final image be not of exile, but of an empty throne awaiting not a master, but a partner to the nation. A symbol now shared rather than imposed, radiant, not because it commands, but because it represents. The bells that once tolled for kings alone began to ring for liberty alongside them. And as they rang, a chapter closed, not with applause nor lamentation, but with a new sound rising, the measured, steady heartbeat of a constitutional kingdom learning to rule itself. James the Septuagint's story ends with loss, but his history ends with clarity. He did not fall because he believed in God, but because he could not see that people too had begun to believe in themselves. And from that realization, the birth of modern Britain, and with it, a new chapter in the human story of freedom, power, and the right to shape one's destiny.